Back. This session is going to be about mental health stigma, an extremely important topic in the Muslim community. So unfortunately our third speaker will not be joining us, but we have our two wonderful speakers on mental health stigma in the Muslim community who will be speaking on their respective topics. The first is Muslim mental health and the advocacy of reforming stigmas in anti-Muslim rhetoric. This will be by Sahar Al-Najjar. Let me go ahead and pull up your bio. So, PhD candidate in clinical psychology, is a Muslim American Palestinian born and raised in Chicago. She received a bachelor's degree in psychology from Governor State University and is currently pursuing a doctoral degree in clinical psychology from the Illinois Institute of Technology. She is the lead sexual assault and mental health counselor at a nonprofit organization serving both the Muslim and mainstream community. Please welcome Sahar.
Okay, so this mic is definitely something different. Assalamu alaikum. Before I jump into this presentation, I know we have a few folks in the room. I just want everyone to kind of look around, look to the right of you, look to the left of you. I know there's not many folks, but the ones you're sitting next to, some people you may know, some people you may not know. And the theory behind this, why I'm starting off like this, is because in a time on the media and in the news where we see a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric and a lot of trauma and pain, in this very moment, each and every single one of you guys is choosing to not be complacent. Oh, thank you. I can clip it, I can clip the mic. So each and every single one of you folks is choosing not to be complacent, even on the micro level, just by being here. You're choosing to not settle for reacting. You're choosing to settle for, not settle, you're choosing to be impacting. Even just by sitting here and being at this conference. This is our Rockstar conference. So thank you all. Thank you for coming to this session, and thank you all for your presence. I just wanted to start off like that. And tying that in, my topic is Muslim mental health and the advocacy, reforming stigmas and anti-Muslim rhetoric. Just to give some context really quick about the diversity in the US with Muslims. Muslims, as we can see from this conference, are a very diverse group. And 1 in 10 Muslims that are coming into the United States that are immigrants identify as with the religion of Islam. And I mean, we're progressively opening up about mental health in our community and talking about ways and avenues and how to seek this type of reform and how to be of betterment to our society and our Islamic communities. Just to give some stats about Muslim Americans and how they are ethnically diverse. So my research kind of discusses how much of what we're learning doesn't really show. So South Asians and African Americans actually play a big chunk of our Islamic background and the Muslims in the United States, and the research doesn't often show this. And so towards working in research towards my dissertation, I like to touch more on this and try to find out as to why most individuals tend to think that Arab Americans are the ones that are the Muslims. Completely identify as Arab American, but unfortunately that's not the reality of what all Muslims are. As again, we can see from this conference, it's super diverse. For some implications on experiencing discrimination. So we see the effects of social media on perceived discrimination. So it's so easy, we turn on the news, right? What do we see? In Untitled Chapter, just a couple weeks ago, we saw what happened in the mosque in New Zealand. And so we see this anti-Muslim rhetoric and this hate and this pain that we endure, and really the attack on marginalized groups. So when we say Muslims, so we say it as a whole, Arab Muslims, our brothers and sisters are African American, our Latino brothers and sisters, who I come from Chicago, and there's racial profiling going on in the streets of Pilsen and Inglewood just for standing on the wrong block. So we see how detrimental this could be. And I wanted to add on to this point and say, when we discuss this very stigma and we turn on the news, we think that things are getting progressively worse, when in reality they're only getting unveiled. Right, so let's be serious and think about, post 9/11, before 9/11. Let's think of all those events that led to that and after that, and how a lot of us kind of felt like we didn't belong, and the detriment it had on our mental health. And so when discrimination happens, it often leaves one to feel like they don't belong. It makes one feel like, what's my part in this? Where do I fit in? I had a lot of folks close to me who felt like they had to flock away. And contrary to that, there's also folks who found support in community. And so that's another thing I focus on, is community support, and how our masjids have a dual role in impacting us. So how they can either make us feel really welcomed or make us feel like we don't belong. And I think the session before this on trauma really highlighted how our massages need to be safe spaces. So we shouldn't meet folks, whether it be from a clinical standpoint or in places of academia, it shouldn't be judgmental. So we should meet people where they are, religiously. Some implicit bias and racial trauma. So some of this anti-Muslim rhetoric comes on in terms of physical characteristics, right? So stereotypes on Muslim men. So how many of you, just quick show of hands, how many of you guys think that, or have heard the notion of Muslim men and Muslim women being oppressed or oppressive? Okay, so it's almost every hand in the room went up. And this is not the reality. This is, again, what media tries to portray to us on these various stereotypes and how discrimination occurs. So some quick clinical implications to time that. So how do we move forward past this discrimination that you highlighted? How do we work past or move forward from this anti-Muslim rhetoric that we're constantly seeing every time we turn on the news? So we know that mental health can be impacted by a number of factors: race, gender, income. We need to do more psychosocial research. I work in psychosocial oncology at Loyola, other than my full-time job at Arab American Family Services, which is a nonprofit organization in the southwest suburbs that's been up and running for about 18 years and serves the Muslim community. We really need to focus on this qualitative area of research, because only then we could meet people where they're at and help them in the area of mental health. And ideally, any clinicians in the room? Wow, mashallah. Okay, so almost again, all the hands went up. So for clinicians who understand this, we can better help our Muslim clients. And another point that I wanted to touch on is the earlier we intervene, the better work we could do. So if we identify some of these early signs, we're able to work with people to give them better coping skills, ideally. And that's just a point that I touched on when I was flying out here. I was like, I needed to add that, I'm gonna forget to add it. So I put it in my phone. Finding resilience through the lens of trauma and anti-Muslim rhetoric. So again, just kind of being hopeful, but being realistic and not talking consecutively about how we're regressing, but also how we're progressing as a community, right? So Muslim Americans, from the trauma that we faced, and trauma comes, it can be vicarious, it comes in many ways, right? And so how do we find that resilience in a time where a lot of us, due to difficulties of experiencing this trauma, we find difficulty moving on to within our day-to-day lives? So becoming familiar with cultural barriers, being culturally competent is extremely important in our Muslim communities. And so I think we tend to get culture and religion almost like an intersectional way confused and mixed up, but it's important to be open when coming to different communities. So coming to South Asians, coming to our African American communities, our Arab communities, our Latin communities, we need to meet people where they are. Again, just touching on that consecutively, and to better treat them. And not treat them, I would say also to grow from and with each other. Making impact in our Muslim American community. So this goes again, this ties in with the resiliency. So with this anti-Muslim rhetoric and the stigmas that we're constantly trying to dismantle, what are some ways that we can make an impact? And so providing counseling services. Again, I about how I work for a nonprofit organization in the heart of the community. I got 5 minutes, okay. And how basically I see a lot of clients that come in with multiple issues, whether it be sexual assault, domestic violence, mental health, and just kind of working with them and meeting them where they're at, and try not to make them change their narrative, but try to find that resiliency in why they have a place in this world and why they're loved, and that's also very important. Again, creating a safe space without judgment. How do we seek liberation? So this is a very intense, deep conversation. I only have 5 minutes, so I can't get too into it. But in the advocacy of Muslim mental health, I follow the liberation health model. So basically just providing that healthy services, a survivor-centric approach to the survivor at all times to promote and find that resiliency. And then this is just my research citations, my works cited, and a quick thank you to wrap up to the Muslim Mental Health Conference across the board for putting this. This is my first year presenting and attending, so I'm super excited. Thank you to the Muslim Mental Health across the board with all the pioneers, Dr. Farhad Bassi, Dr. Hamada, Dr. Shadi Shabak, I don't know if he's in here, Dr. Lamis Shawaheen, who's phenomenal. And just all of you for attending, and my colleague and dear friend who came out all the way from Chicago with me, who's doing her master's in social work. Thank you so much, and inshallah this presentation was a benefit to all. Assalamu alaikum.
All right, thank you so much, Sahar. Okay, let's get on with our next speakers. And just a quick FYI for questions. Please make sure you're writing them down on the index card, and then we will have somebody come around to collect them at the end, okay? All right, so our next speaker is Alaa Mohammad. She will be speaking on re-embracing a progressive, stigma-free approach toward mental illness from medieval Islamic civilization. Alaa holds a BA in psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, as well as certificates in childhood and adolescence studies and cultures and community studies. She has a Quran comprehension program for children and young adults and serves on the Islamic Society of Milwaukee's Education Board as a curriculum consultant. She currently conducts research with the Family and Youth Institute on the history of Muslim mental health and with the Child Stress and Coping Lab on the topic of stigma. So please give a round of applause for Alaa.
Can you hear me with this? Okay. Assalamualaikum, my name is Alaa Mohammad, and I'm a researcher and community educator with the Family and Youth Institute. What I'm going to talk about today is the historical approach towards mental illness from the historical Islamic perspective, showing a rich history of stigma-free attitudes, behaviors, and practices of the early Muslims in regard to mental illness. Then I will touch upon the current Muslim attitude toward mental illness, and then tie that in, or briefly discuss the harms of stigma, and then tie that in with how mental health professionals today can benefit from learning or using these, or knowing this rich history with respect to its holistic, culturally adaptive, and it's full of scientific developments that I would like to emphasize, inshallah. So to begin, historically, the literature suggests that mental illness has been associated with supernatural explanations in ancient civilizations like ancient Egypt, Greece, China, Israel, and India, to say the least. Supernatural explanations have been associated with mental illness, especially in regard to those that display psychotic behaviors. So examples like being possessed by demons or being cursed or a punishment from God. And what that actually does is it puts the blame on the actual individual who's inflicted. When Islam came into Mecca, when it was introduced into Mecca, it actually challenged and reshaped a lot of the approaches or attitudes and conceptualizations of many of the things, thoughts and behaviors in all aspects of life, including thoughts and behaviors concerning mental illness. Islam established a framework of normalizing that God will test people generally with health and wealth, as he will test people with other things like their children and faith. For example, in chapter 2, verse 155, it states, "And we will surely test you with something of fear and hunger and a loss of wealth and lives and fruits, but give good tidings to the patient." This removes the blame from the afflicted person, and it teaches us that fear, loss, health, and poverty, for example, are things that can happen to anyone. He will test to see which people are the best in deeds and character. In chapter 67, verse 2, it says, "It is he who created death and life to test which of you are best in deed, for he is the Almighty, the Forgiving." Muslims were commanded by the Islamic law laid out in the Quran and the Sunnah, which is the life example of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to take responsibility over and manage the affairs of those with mental illness in terms of handling their finances, their providing a place for them, and other things which they need, such as clothing, food, etc. In this verse it says, "And to those who are weak of understanding, do not hand over your property that Allah has made you responsible for, but support and maintain them out of the profits of it, and clothe them and speak to them with words of kindness." There's a clear, in the Quran, a very clear establishment of a tone of compassion when speaking to individuals with mental illness. And a sense of responsibility was accepted by the people as well as expected. So a proper treatment was expected as well. The way Muslims were taught early on to view and handle both severe and mild cases of mental illness guided the attitudes and behaviors of Muslims toward family and community members. The overemphasis of dealing with individuals with compassion and patience in Islam is exemplified even in the smallest or simplest examples. One is when Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was one concern that he often suggested and encouraged people to acknowledge is the grief that comes with loss and death. And Aisha reported that he would encourage presenting a soup that was made of barley and talbina, where she says that so at talbina, this is a quote of the Prophet that says, "At talbina gives rest to the heart of the patient and makes it active to relieve some of his sorrow and grief." Again, this acknowledgement of the immense emotions that a person is experiencing. The keenness of care was especially emphasized or evident when the Islamic civilization developed, and this was especially recognized in the hospitals, the Islamic hospitals. Muslims were the first to establish hospitals that provided care for psychiatric or mental illness. The first hospital in the world to have a psychiatric ward was built in 705 CE in Egypt, and the first, the first hospital to have a unit, or the first standalone, hospital for psychiatric treatment called the Baymeristan was built in 805 CE in Baghdad, and this kind of set the stage for the development of many more hospitals to come. Some examples are Ibn Tulun Hospital and Mansouri Hospital in Egypt, the Adudi Hospital in Baghdad, and the Mawahidi Hospital in Morocco. These Islamic psychiatric institutions became famous for their humane and moral treatment, which was different than what was happening around the world, particularly their emphasis on inclusion and not isolation. The Islamic Psychiatric Institute was also famous for the concept of a psychiatric environment, which provided patients with clean clothes, daily activities, and purposeful activities, bathing, and healthy diets. Physicians visited their patients to provide original treatment that included things like music therapy, massage therapy, Also unique was the interdisciplinary nature of the treatment team, which included members that we would consider today social workers, nurses, chaplains, pharmacists, in addition to the physicians. And the aim of that was to treat the whole patient and not just their illness. Patients were also assigned murafiqin, which is translated to be companion, which is kind of like the buddy system. And the murafiq is someone who would not give care, but actually participate in daily activities like hygiene, eating, and offer emotional support. There was a notion that you treat them until they are cured and are able to get back into society. So depending on the severity of their mental illness, until they are cured notion meant that they would be fully funded to stay in the hospital, in the psychiatric hospital, by the government and community endowments for as long as they needed, even if it meant a lifetime. For those who were released, they would be given a small stipend that would help them get back into society and provide that base for them. There was no room to stigmatize individuals with mental illness, as they had a place in society. Hospitals were purposefully centered in the society. As you can see, I'm going to use the pointer, but the picture to the left is a picture of the entrance to the 13th century Kowloon complex, which is housed in the notable Kowloon Hospital, surrounded by community. You can see society members selling their goods on the streets, again, right in the center of society. That is where individuals were given space. Family members were welcome to visit and were made to feel as part of the family member's treatment plan. Patients were respected and given high-quality care as well as high-quality food. The environment was developed with consideration of how it would impact the patient. For example, large rooms with lots of light, and they were so allowed to go out to courtyards where there were fountains and just a peaceful aroma, just a peaceful environment. And there were storytellers as well as Quran reciters that were included in the therapy, and as well as musicians for the musical therapy aspect of it. So, inspired by assertions like the one made in this statement by Prophet Muhammad, that there is no disease that Allah has created except that He also has created its treatment. Muslims, especially throughout the 7th to the 15th centuries, led the world in its Islamic Renaissance, expanding upon all sorts of scientific knowledge. As hospitals housed thousands of books and became research hubs, there was a genuine interest among Muslim intellectuals to understand mental illness and mental health with every effort to advance treatment and therapies that would provide the best care and promote overall well-being. Some of the leading Muslim scholars in mental health published these are renowned scholars that published books and chapters and treatises on deeply exploring psychological topics and well-being. Again, from the 7th to the 13th or 15th century, these are only a few. Some of the others are well-known: Al-Hindi, Al-Tabari, Al-Afwani, Al-Bukhari, Miskawayh, Al-Ghazali, Al-Jurjani, Ibn al-Ayn, Zabi, Fakhruddin al-Razi. Numerous texts were by Muslim scholars described cognitive components such as depression and sadness, anxiety and fear, obsessions and anger in detail, and suggested a variety of therapies and treatments. Thousands of books, chapters, and treatises were printed and published, and some of these are just translations, but topics like causes of illness, understanding and combating sorrow, healing after grief, dream psychology, diseases of the head and the brain, the mind-body connection, which is something that is incredibly, it's incredible that we can associate that to historical contributions from the 14th century, as it is just now being discovered as something very valuable in psychology. The doctor-patient relationship was discussed, perceptions and emotions, child psychology, or child development, sleep psychology, psychology of happiness, music, and again, these are just a few to say the least. Unfortunately, Muslims of today cannot pride themselves in having a stigma-free attitude toward mental illness. In fact, stigma is a real problem among Muslims today. Research suggests that there are few characteristics that consistently predict the likelihood of stigma. So level of education, contact, ideology-based factors. The more educated a person is, the less likely they are to endorse negative stereotypes and avoid social interactions. Contact provides personal experience that contradicts the negative stereotypes and increases one's level of comfort and decreases social distance. The ideology-based factors include cultural systems, such as the idea of individualism versus capitalism, and other examples like cultures that hold family reputation very high, or have fears of marriage prospects, for example. Today, Muslim community members actually commonly attribute mental illness to demon possessions, black magic, punishment from God. They also attribute blame to the individual. For example, they have weak faith, or it's a poor upbringing in the family. They're less likely to accept, it is common that Muslims are less likely to accept psychological explanations under the assumption that it goes against Islamic teachings to accept something scientific, despite that going against Islamic teachings itself. Muslims are more likely to endorse labeling and oftentimes find religious spaces non-accommodating. There are many harms of stigma, and just a few are that they may deter people from seeking help, impact the quality of treatment even when an individual does seek help, just holding on to that stigma. It leads to social isolation and loneliness, which is something that can exacerbate the actual mental illness and hamper rehabilitation. It's a key reason toward suicidal ideation. Stigma is potentially more disabling than the mental illness itself. So just as Bentley asserted that psychotic symptoms afflict normal people in everyday life, there are modern theories of psychology that assert that psychotic experiences occur on a spectrum and are a part of the average human experience. In his writing, Ibn Hazm, a 10th century philosopher, writes about the universal goal of being free from anxiety. He says, I have tried to find one goal which everyone would universally agree to be excellent and worthy of being striven after. I have found only one only, to be free from anxiety. Eliminating stigma is a necessary means to the goal, as it may help in the prevention of mental illness disorders or mental health disorders and the promotion of mental well-being, as well as in the prevention or the provision of treatment. Some implications are that the historical Islamic context of mental illness gives Muslims today something to relate to from their own heritage. Through knowledge of the Islamic examples of mental health or the Islamic history of mental health, Muslims have solid examples for how to incorporate and encourage stigma-free attitudes, behaviors, and practices into today's Muslim centers, communities, and masajid. We can normalize mental illness and help seeking from professionals, strongly asserting that it is nothing new for Muslims. Muslims should continue investing in this long tradition of mental illness or mental health research. Muslims and their unique demographics need to be included in the research for the field of mental health and illness. More research that applies to Muslims leads to more developed treatments and care that Muslims can actually feel comfortable with using. And that is exactly what we are committed to with the Family and Youth Institute. The Family and Youth Institute is an independent research and education nonprofit organization that aims to support young people and their families through research and on factors that promote positive development of young Muslims and their families. Some of the current research projects we have going are youth risk behaviors, the Black Muslim youth study and the conference study. And we're expanding our research team to include additional studies such as parenting. The FYI disseminates research through varying mechanisms such as webinars, academic publications, daily articles, and intensive workshops. Additionally, we have infographics and animated videos that we disseminate our research through, making sure that the research data that is difficult to crunch can actually be accessible in layman terms. So these research efforts are really made possible when there's collaboration. So what we would like from individuals is to hear more about what Muslim research is necessary. So just kind of hearing your feedback and knowing what issues need to be addressed helps increase the benefit of this team in general. So if you actually log on to Facebook, we have like the page on our Facebook, you will actually receive regular updates of the research that's out there. And there's in-depth understanding of issues, practical issues and solutions that we also provide related to Muslim needs. And then we also offer training, skill development, and toolkits that are relevant to current events. For more information on the depth of the historical contributions, you can actually find the chapter that we co-authored about the mental health in the Islamic golden era, the historical roots of modern psychiatry. This was published recently in the Springer book, Psychiatry in Islamophobia. And just a few references there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sahar and Alaa. So for questions, Aya will be coming around the room for questions. So just quickly raise your hand if you do have a question for her. Okay, well, I have a question myself. There is a lot of stigma, of course, in the Muslim community surrounding multiple topics, but I think one of the biggest that the Muslim community faces is the stigma surrounding sexual abuse and assaults. A lot of times the perception tends to be that women who do come forward are seeking attention, that their trauma isn't realistic, and then people proceed to label them bipolar, this, that, and the third. So what would you recommend that we combat that type of dangerous rhetoric?
So to answer your question, when it comes to the area of sexual assault, it's a really sensitive topic, right? So especially in our communities, working with a Muslim population and being a counselor for clients who often come to me for domestic violence, there is a pattern of struggle in reporting sexual assault. And it is almost like it's almost like mental health and counseling, because it's almost another stigma that is difficult for both men and women to come forward and say this happened to me. So when we say sexual assault, like domestic violence, like mental illness, sexual assault doesn't know caste, creed, color, right? It happens in all of our communities. It's something that all of us need to consecutively work through to dismantle that stigma. An approach that we find ourselves leaning towards is letting the person know that it's not what happened to them that makes them. So we are affiliated with a lot of other universities that do like Title IX, and where it teaches the client that they're not the victim, right? That they're not what happened to them, that night or that day that it happened to them, they can take it back to own up to that narrative. And we need to be more welcoming to our youth and to adults when they come forward and tell them that we believe you. I think often, like you were saying, it's a stigma of you just want attention. So we need to give them that honor and tell them, how can I help you, rather than judge them in that very moment. Or criticize them and say, well, had you not worn this or that, this would have happened to you. So it's something that we need to consecutively work forward and work towards in terms of removing those cultural notions of what should we wear, what should we not, being very sensitive when we say the word haram, not being the haram police, if that makes sense. And again, just reiterating, believing the person, no matter how old they are, no matter where they come from, and seeking ways of how they're going to be able to better themselves and move forward past what happened to them.
Just a quick, I think, being able to use the examples of individuals from the past, the Muslim intellectuals, I think just putting back the focus on your well-being. It's all about your well-being, and I think when our spaces, our Muslim spaces, are concerned with just allowing that healing and the well-being, just normalizing that we're after the care, just being able to talk about it, it should be, I think that the emphasis should be on your well-being, so that in our homes we're talking about care, we're talking about getting better, getting the best treatment possible. In our masajid we're talking about it, in our community centers, we're all focused on actually achieving the higher goal of well-being.
Okay.
This is a vast...
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah, so her question is, where did I do any of the research when it comes to historical, like history of psychology? Where did I find this information? And I guess, was it easy or was it difficult? And so I'm going to be honest with you, I struggled to condense the information. And this is why I was on there reading all of this, because I had to boil down this large bank of information that I was collecting. And honestly, if you look at my references, a lot of these are, so I have this 1992 book called Majnoon, the Madman in Medieval Islamic Society, by my Mutuls. A lot of these Orientalists that traveled and saw these hospitals, there's quite a bit of information out there, and the truth is, yes, it's difficult to find. A lot of it is in different languages, so you have a lot of Arabic, you have a lot of Persian books that delve deeply into these historical or these psychological concepts. And then you have places like the Islamic Institution of Thought that translates, or trying to translate it. But you're talking about centuries of work. Islam, or the Arabic language, was the language of science for centuries. And so there's a lot out there. When you look at the actual work related to psychology today, these theories, a lot of it is kind of just skipped over this rich history of Islam, and goes back to the Greek and Latin work. But there's a lot out there. I think it's really a matter of us digging into it, finding it, bringing it out, and then using it. And I do see that there's a movement. There are quite a few people that are working toward that, and I hope to be among them, which I think would definitely enlighten our actual work moving forward in the field of psychology and treatment.
Okay, so one last question. You gave some reasons for why stigma exists, but most of these factors are not different for the Muslim community today versus the golden age of Islam, cultural values, etc. Why did we lose this rich history?
So just to reiterate, your question was, why did we lose the rich history of supporting the stigma? I mean, dismantling the stigma, or?
So it says most of these factors are not different for the Muslim community today versus the golden age of Islam. So have we used the history that seemed to not allow this? That's how I understand.
Absolutely. I think individuals these days tend to not go back to the days where our history was very much rich. I mean, our history is still, we learn from it, but unfortunately we're not integrating it. And so our history teaches us to be understanding. Our history teaches us to be present, to advocate for others, to fight against stigmas. And in these days, it seems that every person isn't looking at themselves and in the mirror and checking how we could be impactful and what change we can make, rather than looking at the person next to us and finding several reasons and in myriad ways of which they're not making a difference and where they're going wrong. And unfortunately, we can't expect change, we can't expect these stigmas to go away if we don't really start within ourselves. And it's almost like cliche, right? We're taught look in the mirror first. But ideally, I think to answer this question, not to go out too much jargon, is a lot of our history is lost in bias. A lot of our history is lost in not being able to apply a lot of the rich Islamic teachings that we're taught, and rather just kind of applying what we know without context. And unfortunately, if we keep doing that, especially in our communities, we're not going to progress. It's going to be a progressive regression, and that's not something we want. We don't want to progressively go back when ideally our history, Islamically, with mental health, psychology, and psychiatry, and from a clinical standpoint, teaches us that to do better. And when we know better through ilm, because ilm is sunnah, knowledge is sunnah, to act on it. And these days, I think a lot of the stigma comes from that bias of no knowledge and just throwing around any rhetoric and not knowing how sensitive it can be to our communities.
Sure, yeah, definitely. I think there's been a priority shift within our Muslim communities. Muslim intellectuals were funded for research. They were funded for, like, you had government funding more and more of the medical sciences and, just giving into this intellectual culture. And unfortunately, we don't really have that happening. Level of education, I think that once the priority is really to become, continue doing the research, continue really having science-based evidence for what is occurring in mental illness or with mental health, as well as, again, the idea of Muslims centering individuals and saying these are members of our society, individuals with severe and mild mental illness, making sure that there was contact and a lot of personal experience. I think we lack that today. In fact, we have more members hiding from the masajid, more members that are not comfortable, presenting that I do have mental illness or my family member does have a mental illness. It is actually a lot stronger today. So you mentioned that, or whoever the questioner is, that these factors existed then. Again, there's more of a priority that if a family member does have mental illness, this has a negative mark on our family and reputation. Our daughters have less of a chance of getting married, for example, or our son. So these things have really become, they've taken precedence within our Muslim communities. So I do think that it's slightly different than it was, at least in terms of what was priority. I hope.
Can you guys hear me? Very loud now. So one of the things that I wanted to add, because I had done a little bit of research about this previously, is we can't forget the history that came with colonization and with slavery. So a lot of our history was ripped away from us, and which is the reason why she said we can't find a lot of these texts in English. That's an intentional thing, right? There's an intentional purpose behind why we can't find it in English. We have to go back to our roots. We have to go back to different land to be able to find it. A lot of things such as not just mental illness, but like sex. Sex, there's so much shame around sex. There's so much shame about the discussion around sexual acts and sexual link, but in a sense, it's something that's encouraged. And there's so much history in books in Arabic, that you can find, but you can't find that nowadays because of colonization and slavery. So if you guys look right before, the date right before that, you guys will find a lot of that history.
That's a really good point. And I just also wanted to add, just kind of like a personal note. My father has epilepsy. And I remember his very first seizure happened to be at the masjid, at the mosque. And people were literally screaming out, Jinadeo school, which means a jinn has come. But I was like, okay, is this the rhetoric that people follow? Like, this is crazy. I mean, there's not about to be a witch doctor at UofM hospital. But, an imam had come to us, and he said that there are hadiths, sahih hadiths, about epilepsy, and how, this is something that is considered like a real illness. I kind of want to mirror what you said, that there's a wealth of information, and there's so much, yet unfortunately, due to colonization and multiple factors, we're not allowed almost to seek that knowledge. So I'm happy you both brought that up. Okay, are there any more questions? All right, I believe our next session is actually going to be the keynote session, which is going to be in what room? In this room?
Yeah, so this wall is going to be lifted, and so the keynote's going to be this entire wall room, and we're going to actually, I think your schedule will say 11:15, but it's going to be delayed to 11:20. One of the sessions is running behind. But
Okay, so if you guys want to go grab some water or something like that. But thank you so much to both our speakers once